Good afternoon, everybody. Are we good to go? Yes? People are still settling in. Sorry? Can you hear me? Yeah? Yes, they can hear me. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. I think you are still joining us, I can see in the back. It's wonderful to see such a turnout for a session on history, as it has been throughout this festival. I thought these were pretty good turnouts for history until I introduced Devdutt Patnaik yesterday and got a rapturous welcome. That was my 5 minutes of fame. So mythology still trumps it over history in this country, at least. My name is Ira Mukhoti, and the subject of our discussion this afternoon has changed slightly from the original one because Manu Pillai was unfortunately unable to join us, and therefore it is, the session today is the Great Mughal Debate. What did the Mughals do for us? There has been an efflorescence of writing in India on Indian history recently, and happily the subjects covered have been increasingly broad, whether it's the history of the Deccan, a gendered history of women, examining known events from news sources such as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and these are wonderful new developments. But the Mughals still continue to fascinate and in some cases infuriate us. The Mughals are relatively close to us in time, which is one of the reasons this is so. We still have a lot of sources, a lot of written documents, a lot of materials related to them, so it's easier, for example, to write about them than the Cholas or some of the other kingdoms. But it is a not insignificant fact that the subheading to this discussion today is what have the Mughals done for us, that we are still in a position 70 years, more than 70 years after independence on the 26th of January, still having to describe what the limits of Indianness are and who deserves to be Indian and who is not, and what are the definitions we might use to elaborate that discussion. But despite the current political trend to provide a more binary narrative of good versus bad Muslim, of them versus us, there has very luckily been, almost in reaction, though it's subliminal if that is so, has been a spate of writing on the subjects which show the Mughals to us in a much more nuanced manner, showing them in all their glory, but also with their fallibilities and their vulnerabilities. So joining us today to take this discussion forward is a panel of three extremely distinguished scholars and writers, whom I will introduce. To the extreme right, to your left here, is Parvati Sharma. She is a writer, the author of The Dead Camel and Other Stories of Love, Close to Home, and a book for children, The Story of Babur. Parvati's first work of non-fiction, Jahangir, an intimate portrait of a great Mughal, has been described as an audacious conversationalist history that treats the emperor as a literary character, ambiguous, self-contradicting, unheroic. Next to me is Rana Safvi, an author, translator, columnist, and blogger deeply interested in India's syncretic culture, which she documents via its history, cultural heritage, monuments, clothes, food, and festivals. She is the founder of the popular Twitter forum Shire that helped revive interest in Urdu poetry. Her latest book is City of My Heart, which is a translation of 4 lost Urdu texts that describe Delhi in the 19th century, specifically around the uprising of 1857. In the center is Professor Audrey Truschke, who is Assistant Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University, Newark. Her first book, Cultures of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, was published in 2016. Her second book, Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth, was published in 2017 and is a historical reassessment of one of the most hated kings in South Asian history. Unfortunate to have to introduce him like that, but there we are. More broadly, she publishes on cross-cultural exchanges, historical memory, and imperial power. So Audrey, I'd like to start with you this afternoon, if I may, and refer to your first book, Cultural Encounters. We do not often think of the Mughals associated with Sanskrit, the work that they did around that, but that is something that you discovered through, amongst many other things, your reading of Sanskrit texts themselves. So tell us a little bit more about how the Mughals were associated with Sanskrit.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really my pleasure to be here today with such an illustrious panel, a panel of all women, might I say, definite plus. So ladies, very happy to be here. So the basic thesis of Culture of Encounters, my first book, is as follows. The Mughals were seriously into Sanskrit. That is surprising to many people because we think of the Mughals as a Persian-speaking dynasty, often in an exclusionary way, and I argue that that's incorrect. And it's also surprising to people because, as most of us know, the Mughals were Muslim, right? And in sort of thinking through sort of modern communalist terms, if you're a Muslim, well, you can't be interested in Sanskrit. Well, as it turns out, whether that's true today or not, I leave aside, but it certainly wasn't true in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so I use basically a largely untouched archive, namely text written in Sanskrit, as well as Persian translations of Sanskrit materials, in order to flesh out the different facets of the Mughal interest in Sanskrit literary culture through the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, coming to a close with the ascension of Aurangzeb Alamgir. And the Mughals did a lot of stuff with Sanskrit. They had Sanskrit intellectuals at their courts. They translated Sanskrit text into Persian. They paid Sanskrit intellectuals to do various things at court, to be astrologers, to be traveling companions to the king, to participate in philosophical debates, and also to write Sanskrit text. And I mentioned that last one especially because that helps us place the Mughals as they should be properly placed, as one in a long line of Indian kings. Indian kings had been patronizing Sanskrit intellectuals for 1,000 to 1,500 years before the Mughals, and the Mughals continued that tradition relatively unabated, at least through Shah Jahan.
Thank you for that, Audrey. And talking of translations, one of the famous translations that we do hear about sometime, but we forget the wider impact of it, is Dara Shikoh's translations of the Upanishads through which these thinkings went to the West. Yes, Rana? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Dara Shikoh translated the Upanishads. It's called the Sir-e-Akbar. He involved a lot of Brahmin priests from Banaras as well as Persian scholars. And when that went to the West is where Schopenhauer heard about it, and it actually started a debate on Vedic Sanskrit literature. And that's how it went there. A lot of the studies have been done on that, based on that. So carrying forward what Audrey just told us, that the Sanskrit and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata translated by, it was translated in the court of the Mughal, which was asked, Akbar wanted it translated, and the reason he got it translated was, as Abul Fazl says, that once you get to know about each other's religion, hatred decreases, or bigotry decreases. So unless we know about each other, you always have some kind of misconception. And the book, the Ramayana in Persian, was read by Hamida Bano, that is Akbar's mother, as well as a whole list of other royals who have signed for it in the library.
Salima Sultan Begum and...
Yes.
I just wanted to cut in there because Rana, you mentioned, so both the Mahabharata and Ramayana were translated under Akbar, and we are actually all sitting only a few short kilometers from the master imperial copies of both of those manuscripts. They are both held in the Jaipur Royal Collection, although they have been inaccessible for a number of decades.
Yes, that is very unfortunate that we haven't been able to see it, because the miniatures in that are glorious, apart from the text.
So if anybody has connections in this audience, please make them accessible.
Please
that was the aim of this panel discussion. To go from very famous emperors or very famous figures in Mughal history, from Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh briefly, I want to turn to you, Parvati, to talk about one of the lesser-known emperors. Like Humayun, Jahangir has been somewhat forgotten by history. I think sandwiched between great men, Akbar and Shah Jahan. Even his wife overshadows him. I shouldn't say even, but his wife overshadows him too. So tell us a little bit of some of the findings that you had and some of the stuff, the important stuff that he did do.
So yeah, it's true. In a sense, Jahangir is actually remembered for being forgotten, and for not being worth remembering. That he's sort of a wastrel who's drank too much and governed too little. But the fact is that he did rule for 22 years, and these were 22 years that were largely peaceful, largely prosperous. So he must have been doing something write. And in the course of writing about him, I mean, I discovered many things about him that are very appealing and illuminating, not least the Jahangirnama itself, which, I mean, I have read only in translation, but even in translation, it is just a fascinating work. Ever since I read it, I recommend it to everybody to read, because it's so accessible, so lucidly written, so full of anecdote. And, you know, how often you get to read about an emperor confessing to alcoholism and murder within 25 pages or so of his diary. So besides that, of course, he was a great patron of art. Some of the most beautiful paintings of the Mughal court, from the Mughal court, came during his period, including one, I didn't know this, of the dodo, which it turns out the only authentic image of a dodo painted from a real live specimen was made during Jahangir's time. And so there are many things to explore in his character. And I find also, I think, in the course of writing about him, and you know, in placing him in the context of the first six Mughals generally, I feel that somehow this forgotten, undistinguished character that he has was in a way an advantage, because, and you know, I think when we think of the Mughals, largely. And I mean, in the way that we have, you know, grown up reading about them, learning about them in school, having them in a popular culture, popular discourse. Largely, we focus on Akbar and Aurangzeb, and largely we view them through this lens of, you know, a secular hero and a communal villain. Which, you know, and Audrey, like in your book, you do much to ameliorate that situation. And this, you know, it doesn't tell us very much about them, and perhaps it's no coincidence that this tussle between secularism and communalism is something that India has been grappling with over the course of, you know, our independent life as a nation. So when you come to Jahangir, where there is no sort of burden of expectation for either heroism or villainy from him, in him you can see many multiple factors coming together. It's not just one thing or the other. So he is for example, he is brought to the throne partly as a result of conservative Muslim Sunni support, sick to death of Akbar's increasingly relentless experimentations with syncretism, and at the same time he has a Hindu Brahmin guru, you might say, Jadrup Gosen, whom he visits regularly, derives evidently some sort of spiritual satisfaction from these visits. And, you know, on the third hand, you have him described by travelers such as Thomas Roe as a man who is bred without religion, as an atheist who believes nothing. And all three things sort of coexist in him, and in a way, perhaps mirror something of, you know, the negotiations, the compromises that go into making what we call the Great Indian Melting Pot. Yeah.
And you mentioned the miniature of the dodo. Jahangir was really fascinated by the natural world around him.
Yes.
And I find that, you know, he was really one of the emperors who wanted to document this Indian landscape that he inhabited, you know, through the miniatures, through everything he did, right? His recordings, his personal recordings. He was, after all, the son of a Rajput woman, Harkabai, from near here, from Amber. So a very Indian man in that sense, right? Through his paintings. Can you tell us more about his miniatures, the kind of things the natural world that he enjoyed recording?
He enjoyed the natural world hugely. I mean, there's this one incident from in the Jahangirnama when he had a sort of visceral reaction to beauty. He seems to have, and he and his noblemen are marching along a river, and he says there was a field of oleander blossoms in bloom. And it was beautiful, and so he commanded his nobility to pluck the flowers and stick them into their turbans. And he says a field of marching flowers was thus created. You know, he's almost sort of painting these pictures with his words. And in the paintings from his times, of course, there's beauty. I mean, there's all kinds of animals. dodo, zebra, the turkey, some beautiful birds, elephants. But the one that I find most compelling is not an animal. It's the painting of a human being. It's the painting of a nobleman called Inayat Khan, and it's the Dying Inayat Khan. And this is a man who comes to Jahangir literally at death's door. He says, I'm feeling sick, I want to go home. And Jahangir says, yes, of course you must. And he gives him a little grant also. But he says, before that, he says, he summons his painters. And he says, I've never seen a man so sick. And painters, when they portray sickness, they are never able to get it right. And so then he makes them, paint this poor man who dies the next day or the day after. And it's if you look it up, it's a compelling portrait of a man who is, dying in front of your eyes. But there was something within him, obviously, that compelled him to document every aspect of the natural world, and perhaps as a way of understanding, owning, ruling.
Part horror, part fascination one feels in that image, right? And another extraordinary thing that I just want to mention to all of you, sadly, our fourth panelist fell ill, Professor Ruby La, so we are denied her wonderful insights. And I just wanted to share a few things because she was on a panel with me yesterday, and she was mentioning, since we are talking about Jahangir, his wife, of course, Noor Jahan, who is more famous for having had Jahangir in such sexual thrall that he was unable to think for himself once he met her. And this was really blatantly, untrue. And they had a partnership of sorts, which Ruby Lal has brought out in her book, so amazingly, that Jahangir and Noor Jahan were co-sovereigns. They were ruling together. And some of the things that Noor Jahan did, which we are usually told about as bullet point things, like she shot tigers, and she had coins struck in her name, and she appeared at the Jharaka window, for example. These were very specific symbols of sovereignty, and we must see that in that context, that she was allowed to be a sovereign next to her husband, and the only woman in Indian history to have exercised that kind of co-sovereignty with her husband. So it's something worth talking about, and I wanted to bring it to your attention since Ruby isn't here to talk about her work herself. Rana, to come to you, some of your earlier works, I wanted to mention, has been more on the buildings, the Mughal buildings of Delhi and now some of the other cities. So tell us something that you have seen through the study of these buildings.
Today, of course, the Taj Mahal is famous all over the world. People, whenever you think of India, the icon that is there is of the Taj Mahal. But this kind of architecture, the Char Bagh, the Hasht Bahisht architecture was introduced in the reign of Akbar when Humayun's tomb is being built in Delhi. Now there you have, of course you had this entire Indo-Saracenic and Indo-Islamic architecture from the Sultanate period itself. But for the first time, Persian architecture is introduced in Delhi in the tomb of Humayun. And you have this concept of it's called Hasht Bahisht, which means a representation of heaven. As per the Quran, in the Quran it says that Jannat has rivers of milk and honey, and there's water bodies, and it's set in a garden. So you have this concept of a Char Bagh, which means in the center you have the tomb, which in a kind of a quadrangle where you have divided parts, and it's all divided by water bodies with octagonal tomb in the middle. So this architecture came to India, and because it came from Persia, it came to India, it was being executed by Indian artisans. So you have such a beautiful blend where you are using red sandstone because that is available in India. It would not be available in Iran. So things like the Taj Mahal or the Humayun's tomb or even Itmad-ud-Dawla, which is made by Noor Jahan for her father, they could only be made in India. And you see the beautiful blending of architecture, the lotus and the finial of a temple being adopted in a mosque. You go to Jama Masjid, the first thing that you see is are the three domes. The most beautiful part of the dome, because I often go to stand on top of the minar from where you can see the dome, the most beautiful part of the dome to me is the inverted lotus. The lotus and the finial comes from the temple, and this is what is the beauty of the Mughal architecture, that you have combined the best of all the worlds, the sensibilities that had come with them, the people who came, because there was a continuous migration into India from Central Asia, Iran, They each come with their own sensibilities, with their own artistry, and they adapt it to Indian conditions. And the Indians also rise, obviously, they come up with it. And
the
so
tradesmen
you have
are all Indian,
such beautiful this thing. And not only in architecture, in food, in painting, as Parvati just said. Food, biryani is, I was just told, I was doing an interview with somebody from one of these French papers, and I was told that on Ziggy and on Zomato, biryani is the most ordered dish. So it's not just, in everything, there is so much of contribution from, and again, the biryani that we eat here is nothing like what is eaten in Iran. I've lived many years in the Middle East. Nothing that we do here is similar to what is done in the Middle East, whether it is food or any other practices. So all this is beautifully Indian.
And chicken tikka masala, as we all know, is the favorite English dish, right? So, Audrey, to come to you, Aurangzeb, in an increasingly binary world, is the evil emperor par excellence. And one of the reasons we often told that he was so supremely evil was that he murdered his brothers. But, as we have now been told, as Munis Farooqi has shown in his wonderful book, Princes of the Mughal Empire, this was a way for the princes to be increasingly competitive. And this was something which has a very long history in Timurid history. So tell us a little bit about how this really became a Western perception of how kingship should be inherited.
So even in Aurangzeb's day, you had Western observers, travelers here in India, who came with the assumption of primogeniture, right? There's a fancy word. It means that the eldest son should ascend the throne, right? The other son should not have a claim. And so Europeans on the ground in the 1650s in India were horrified by the War of Succession. They saw it as bloody. They saw it as worthless, as a waste of life. But these were outsiders, right? These were Europeans. This is a classic case of cross-cultural misunderstanding. Indians on the ground, Mughal and non-Mughal alike, understood very well what was going on, which was a sort of a competition for the throne that allowed the best and most able man to rise to the forefront, right? And I'm sort of hesitating in choosing my words carefully here because I have no opinion whether this was good or bad. There are so many more interesting questions to ask about the past rather than how do you personally feel about it, right? For me, this is a fact of history, and what I want to do is I want to understand why it was so. How is it that a bloody, nearly 2-year war of succession that results in the ascension of Alamgir to the throne, how is it that that is a good thing? Right, in the sort of Mughal imagination, the Mughal world, the sort of major way that I think that this worked is that it allowed the princes to sort of bring new groups into the empire and sort of try their hand at being an emperor who brings people together. And so the guy able to get the most support through diplomacy, through trickery, right, through sort of any means necessary, is generally the guy who ends up on the throne. One very curious thing about the War of Succession that resulted in Aurangzeb becoming king and becoming Alamgir, the ruler of Hindustan, is precisely that he won, because Aurangzeb was not the favored son. Despite the fact that the Mughals did not have primogeniture, that did not sort of stop Shah Jahan from at least thinking about breaking the rules. Shah Jahan favored Dara Shikoh, his eldest son, above the other three. He seems to have particularly disliked Aurangzeb. And we know that because he sort of sent Aurangzeb away. Aurangzeb was very rarely at court in Delhi during his princely years. Dara had every advantage. He had Shah Jahan's backing, he always had more money than Aurangzeb, he always had a higher mansab rank, and he had his father's goodwill. He was at the central court in Delhi. Despite having every advantage in that sense, Aurangzeb still won, right? The Mughal succession practices worked. The War of Succession did bring the most able emperor to the throne, which Aurangzeb, sort of ultimately demonstrates by growing the Mughal empire to its greatest extent in history.
I remember reading somewhere that Shah Jahan had written a critical letter to Aurangzeb about the quality of the mangoes he sent him. So pretty petty at a certain level, it seems.
Aurangzeb really loved mangoes.
To add to this, when Aurangzeb came and ascended the throne, the Red Fort that had been made by Shah Jahan had only the Lahori Gate. Today, where we see the space from where the Prime Minister gives a speech, that is the Barbican which was added by Aurangzeb. And when Shah Jahan came to hear that something like this had been made over there, he sent a letter to Aurangzeb from Agra fort saying कि तुमने दुल्हन को पर्दा घूंघट पहना दिया, that you have veiled the bride because you could no longer see the Lahori gate from the road coming up from Chandni Chowk. So he wasn't very approving of any, and this had an administrative reason. Aurangzeb did it because it was very inconvenient for the nobles who had to get off all the way from Fatehpuri Masjid, which is at the end of Chandni Chowk, and then walk all the way up. So he said, you know, to make it more convenient, we'll do it, because as far as the emperor could see from the Diwane arm, they had to get down. So poor thing, he was trying to do his best, but whatever, he was never
much loved by
never loved by Shah Jahan.
But the much-loved prince, Dara Shikoh, it's often thought, such a romantic image about Dara Shikoh. He would have made a great king. What do you think, Audrey? Considering he never had much experience on the field, he was kept at court, he was indulging perhaps more in his Sufi exercises and his mystical sort of exercise. Would he have made a good king?
So historians are not ones for
speculation.
I will say a couple of things, though. I will say that Dara Shikoh would have been every bit as cruel and sort of prone to violence as Aurangzeb, right? Dara Shikoh would have killed all of his brothers as well, right? And for those who are sort of keeping score, Aurangzeb killed 2 of his brothers. The only reason why he didn't kill the 3rd is he couldn't find him. He would have killed all 3 if he could have found them. And Dara wouldn't have done any different. In fact, historians think that Dara probably had a plan to murder his 3 brothers sort of preemptively in the early 1600s that just never came to fruition. The other thing that I'll say is, so Dara Shikoh, I mean, he had narrow alliances. He's often thought of as a Sufi. He was actually primarily affiliated with the Qadri Sufis and did not do well with other Sufi groups. And he was terrible on the battlefield, right? The man could not run a military operation to save his life, literally, as the case turned out. And that's a problem, right? The Mughals were an expansionist dynasty. You have to be able to conduct military operations successfully. So in short, I think that Dara would have been a disastrous emperor.
You heard it here. Parvati, to come back to your book, you describe a lot of incidents which remind us that Asia was the center of the world at that time. We often, the way we are taught history here, it is Anglo-centric, so we see the world from outside into India, but you've done the opposite and shown us how the reason that people were traveling to India was its great wealth. So tell us a little bit about the interactions with Thomas Roe, how he fit into the court at that time, and what he had to do to gain access.
No, this was one of the most. I wasn't prepared to be surprised by it because we do have an idea of, Mughal Hindustan as being rich and being powerful. But the details of that wealth and power are really astonishing when you read them. And so Thomas Roe is the first English ambassador to the Mughal court. He comes from King James's court in England to what is Hindustan. And he comes basically with a sort of 2-point agenda. One is to gain trading concessions for the East India Company. The East India Company has just been formed. Jahangir becomes emperor in 1605, and the East India Company is formed just a few years previously. And his second agenda, Roe's second agenda, is to sort of manufacture and then maintain some kind of equality between the court of England and the court of the Mughal, which is an almost impossible endeavor, and yet sort of Roe is very dogged about it. And his troubles begin before he even disembarks from his ship. He arrives on the coast of Gujarat, and he's informed that the protocol is that foreign ships and their cargo and their crew is to be searched, and often the searching can be quite undignified. And so Thomas Roe protests, and he says that nobody's going to come, nobody's going to touch me. Then he embarks on this sort of prolonged stalemate. Once he gets off, and then he gets back on again. Another time he gets off, and by this time the authorities have sort of realized that this man is a bit stubborn. So they say, "You go on ahead," and he goes on ahead, and then they pounce on the men behind and start sort of searching them. And one of them manages to escape and goes running to Roe, and he says, they're searching us. And Roe comes back, he draws his sword, he comes back, and he says, I would rather die than allow myself to suffer this kind of humiliation. And the anger is palpable. It's in his journal. And when I was reading this, I thought how the world has changed, because how now it is travelers from the east who go to the west, not the ports but the airports of Europe, America, England who find themselves subjected to similar suspicion, similar indignity. And of course, that is a question of how power works. And at that time, power was very much vested in the East, and in the East, Hindustan was one of the most powerful kingdoms.
And to bring in a little bit of the gender history, wasn't he? He was also very surprised to find a woman, Nur Jahan, in such a position of power, whereas back home at that time, women did not control their own wealth independently. Their wealth, when they had any, was handed over to their husband, and they didn't control it. So he was really, surprised about the way Nur Jahan was able to conduct trade, and it is around suspicions like this that a lot of, gossip about incest and irregular sexual practices amongst the Mughal princesses arose. Rana, can we come to your your last book, which is a translation of 4 Urdu texts, which revolve around 1857, and which tell us something about the last stages of Mughal rule. So what can you tell us about that?
So I've translated 2 books. One is Dastan-e-Ghadar, which is an eyewitness account of the uprising of 1857 by Zahir Dehelvi, who was present when the soldiers come from Meerut and etc., etc. Again, where they talk of, they're just talking of Hindustan and they're just Hindustanis. There is no mention of any other, factor there as in religion or any other thing. And the second book is The City of My Heart. It's a set of 4 translations. Describing the life under the last 2 Mughals, Akbar Shah II and Bahadur Shah. And that is so fascinating, which is why I went into decided to translate them, because they describe a life which is, at this point of time, when The City of My Heart, these 4 books are written, it is the British who are governing India. By 1803, Lord Lake has come, and the Mughal emperor has basically become a pensioner. And most decisions are taken by the British. There's a British resident living in Delhi. There's a commander living inside the fort. And the emperor really, as the saying goes, Sultanate Shah Alam as Dilli Ta Palam. So even by the time Bahadur Shah comes, I don't even think Palam is included in his empire. It's only the Red Fort. And it gives such a beautiful description of the Red Fort, life within it, of life within Shah Jahanabad, which is what is now called Old Delhi, where people are living, and the popularity of the king himself. And there is another book called, which I haven't translated, but it's called Dilli Ki Aakhri Shama, in which Faratullah Beg says that when the Basha was exiled, he said people were crying, and he uses the word, he says, Hindu and Musliman sab aise ro rahe the jaise ki koi unka apna saga chala gaya. So the emperor was that loved over there. And there's a passage in one of the translations. The book is called Dilli Ka Aakhri Deedar. It is written, it was published in 1934, written by Sayyid Wazir Hasan Dehelvi, in which I'd like to read this passage. I'm reading my translated part of it. He says that the Mughal rulers not only conquered Hindustan, but they made it their beloved home. And just as an individual fills his home with treasures, they fill their home with their language, administration, architecture, their ways of living, attitudes, music, poetry, cultural pursuits, and with their knowledge of art and the sciences. They transformed the country into a garden of delight. For their subjects, every day was like Eid and every night like Shab Barat, and they were always in a festive mood. So this is the life that they are describing. As I said, by that time, there were no more wars being fought by the Mughals, and so it was a very peaceful time where you have Ghalib and you have Zokh, and the language that we now call Urdu, which was known as Rekhta at that time, or Hindi, is at its zenith. Poetry is at its zenith. You have so much of culture, music is being developed, Khayal, Drupad, all that is being developed at that time. So it's, it's a period of beautiful, kind of a cultural renaissance.
Right, and the love that the people had for the Padshah, I mean, the sense that he remained a symbol despite the British being there for 150 years is something, that shocked the British during the 1857 uprising, right?
And there is incident in Dastan-e-Ghadar, which I quote quite often. There are two separate incidents, which to me were very, very telling. One is that, and Zahir Dehlvi just describes that he is, it's nothing in your face or something where he is doing it in a very pointed way. He's just describing a normal episode. He says that once the Qasais of Shah Jahanabad, that are the butchers, they were told that they had to leave Shah Jahanabad because they were dirtying the city by the British. As I said, the British were ruling it. So when Bahadur Shah gets up in the morning on the Reti, which is now MG Road in Delhi, the Yamuna is to flow there, he sees that these people are camped over there. And he says, what's the matter? And they say that we've been told to leave the city. And so Bahadur Shah calls his wazir and says, put my tent next to them. And his tent is put next to them. And then when the Qiledar and the resident, both the British officers, when they come to know about it, they come running and say, Hazur, what are you doing? And he says, Jahan mere log, wahan main. I'm going to be where my people are. If you want to throw them out, you throw me out also. So, of course, the British relent and they are allowed to come back. A few days, a few weeks or months later, the Ghosis, that is the people who sell the cows, they are told to leave the city. So these are two people belonging to different communities. And the same thing, when he sees them there, and he sees, again, he says, pitch my tent with them, because if they are to be kicked out, I will be kicked out with them too. And when the British officer comes, he says, after I die, आप ईंट से ईंट बजा लीजिएगा शहर की, लेकिन जब तक मैं जिंदा हूँ ये मेरे लोग हैं और आप इनको नहीं, मतलब till as long as I'm alive, these are my people. And that is his last prayer, where he says when he's leaving, it's recorded again in City of My Heart. It was recorded by his daughter Kulsum Zamani Begum, recorded by Khwaja Hassan Nizami in Begmat Ke Aansu, where the last prayer of the Badshah is, don't let the people of Delhi suffer because of me. And he says that the Hindus and Muslims are both my children. Don't let them suffer because I was leading the revolt over here. So that is why they were so loved, because they loved their people.
And these Urdu texts that you have translated in City of My Heart, this is the first time that they've been translated into English? Yes. So, this is another sort of clue to the reason why there's so much myth-making around some of the Mughals, why their history is so easily usurped by people who want to push a particular agenda, is that we have slowly been disenfranchised from our own history. We no longer speak Persian, we no longer even speak Urdu. All monetary aid to Persian is slowly being removed, and soon there will be very few scholars who actually can speak Persian in this country, and all these manuscripts are therefore out of our common purview. But talking about languages, Audrey, you read Persian and Sanskrit, you're a polyglot. So what can you tell us about the primary sources you were able to access for Aurangzeb, and what is your favorite source that gave you the best insight into a man like Aurangzeb?
So Aurangzeb is arguably the most well-documented Mughal emperor, and that's perhaps surprising to some to hear. The sources are, more frequently translated into English for Akbar's reign, for example. But if you're looking at Persian sources, it really doesn't get better than Aurangzeb Alamgir. There is a wealth of information and different kinds of sources: court histories, non-court histories, sympathetic histories, not sympathetic histories, sort of written by different people. I looked at all of that was available, working from printed editions where possible. I used manuscripts where printed editions were not possible. I looked at the letters written by Aurangzeb Alamgir to his sons, to his grandsons, to various nobles. When letters were a sort of semi-private, semi-public business at the very elite levels of Mughal society, we have some of these letters today because they were later collected into sort of an edited volume of letters, if you will, and then those manuscripts were copied over time. I looked at poetry, right? The use of literature is important if underappreciated in history. I don't have a favorite among these sources. It all depends on what you want to know. A court history will tell you something different than a critical history, right? A letter by Aurangzeb will tell you something different than a letter from one Mansabdar to another about Aurangzeb, right? So history is really all about asking good questions in that sense. I will add just a couple more things. One is that there are sources on Aurangzeb Alamgir that are little touched and little accessed, including by myself. And the chief example of that are the akhbaret, the news reports. This was a common practice. The Mughals did it, the Marathas did it, everyone basically did it at 16th, 17th centuries in India. So you had people, spies and open spies, various people reporting in sort of all corners of India. And then these people would send sometimes daily, sometimes weekly news reports, right? This is, your sort of like bullet point headlines of the day. So we have the akhbarets going back to Aurangzeb's court for a significant chunk of his reign. These have never been published. They have certainly never been translated, and they're in somewhat difficult to access archives, right? And archival access is a big issue in India. If you're like me, you have a professor, I'm a professor, I have a job, right? I have to like show up in Newark from time to time. I can't always just come to India and sit for months and months and months looking at a single source in a single archive, right? So the inability to get both access and digital copies is a sort of ongoing issue. And I think that the akhbaret sort of hold a big key to understanding Aurangzeb in the future. Maybe what I'll end on in terms of sources here is on a sort of slightly negative note. So the closest that I come to sort of ever having an emotional reaction to Aurangzeb Alamgir is that I'm very unhappy that he fired his court historian.
That feels personal.
Yeah, well, it's very personal to me. So he had this guy, Muhammad Kazim, who was there, and he was there for the first 10 years of his reign, and then he writes this book, the Alamgir Nama, right? So this is like the Jahangir Nama, or the Babur Nama, except not written by Alamgir, written by this other guy, about the first 10 years of Aurangzeb Alamgir's reign. Aurangzeb gets the book and promptly reassigns the guy to another job at higher pay. So, he doesn't throw him out, but he never appoints another court historian. Court histories have their limitations, but they are incredibly useful in many ways. And I really, really wish that I had an official court history for the last 39 years of Aurangzeb's reign.
So again, if anyone has connections to museums, come and see us afterwards. So to just touch upon the very incendiary T word, temple destruction, tell us very briefly how this comes into the whole idea of power display at that time, how it was part of Aurangzeb, perhaps his idea of being a just king, and how you interpret it in his history.
So Aurangzeb Alamgir ordered the destruction and the desecration of a certain number of temples in India. I say a certain number because we don't have an exact number, and we are never going to have an exact number, right? Part of the mark, by the way, folks, of a good historian is that they admit when our knowledge is just not enough. So we have somewhere between 12 and 14 confirmed temple destructions during Aurangzeb Alamgir's reign within Mughal territory. Fewer than a dozen are directly tied to his orders. Aurangzeb did not invent destroying temples, okay? Indo-Muslim kings had been destroying temples in sort of select areas and for select reasons, usually political ones, for hundreds of years before Aurangzeb's rule. And if you think that the Ghurids are the ones, or someone who invented this, you would be mistaken, right? It was, quote, Hindu kings who came up with the idea of desecrating each other's temples as a way to display political power. That is something that tends to sit very ill with moderns. That would be all of us in this room, right? Modern people today. And that's because we now view religious places, houses of worship, as a sort of special set-aside sanctuary place, right? As an illegitimate target of state-sponsored violence. I completely support that view in modern times. I feel that way as well. That is not how things were in pre-modern India, right? Temples housed the authority of certain kinds of peoples, both rulers as well as associates of the temple, and so they were considered legitimate targets of state action. Perhaps another thing to note about Aurangzeb's targeting of temples was that he didn't target temples everywhere, right? Most notably, he did not tend to destroy temples in South India when he was on campaign. He did not seem to consider the destruction of temples to be an advantageous political act when trying to integrate new areas into the Mughal Empire.
Excellent. So Parvati, Audrey has talked about how Aurangzeb fired his court historian. Jahangir did this job himself. He wrote his own history, right? Which is a wonderful insight into the man. What I like about Jahangir's history is that he said some pretty candid things about what he did, about the flaying of people, right, and certain unusual acts. So, how does it feel seeing a man through such? How come he was so open about his vulnerabilities, about his excesses even?
Well, see, in some ways, of course, he's very open about his excesses. He does.
Was it meant to be read as a history, like for future generations? Do you think? Was it a personal project?
Well, so I can only tell you what I have read, and what I have read is that there are basically two ways in which the Dhangitnama tends to be understood, and one as a sort of anecdotal, unself-conscious account of one man's interests, pleasures, displeasures. If he didn't like somebody, if he had them killed in some gruesome manner, or whatever. It's a diary, and it's sort of written in real time. Sometimes he's happy, sometimes he's sad, he's upset. He's very proud of his son Shah Jahan. He's very upset with his son Shah Jahan. But then there are sort of recent historians, and Corinne Lefebvre amongst them, who's described it as a model of imperial propaganda, suggesting that every word of it is very well thought out, and every word of it is meant to convey something. And so in that sense, so yes, he confesses to drinking a lot. Yes, he confesses to having Abul Fazl, that is, he didn't dismiss a historian, but he had one assassinated, Akbar's court historian. But he does not admit to, rebelling against his father. He doesn't say, he doesn't admit to sort of, in fact, whenever he talks about Akbar, it's always with a great deal of affection. So
he often remembers him in his
biography.
I wish he were here to see this.
Yes, I wish he were here to eat
He may
this
have
fruit.
been there.
Yes, if he could have this fruit, I'd be so happy. So there is a calculation, obviously, going on there. So and I think that maybe one example of this, which struck me, is that there's a story of how Jahangir was born, the Prince Salim, right? And that is that's a famous story. Everybody knows that Akbar couldn't have children. He went to Sheikh Salim Chishti. He asked for a boon, and the Sheikh said, "You will have 3 sons." The first of them was Salim. But there's also a story of how just as the Sheikh contributed to Salim's birth, so Salim seems to have contributed to the Sheikh's death. And Jahangir tells this story that soon after he was born, Akbar went to visit Sheikh Salim Chishti again, and he said to him, impertinently rather, when will you die? And the Sheikh, responded, and he said that when your son, Salim, memorizes something and speaks it aloud, that is when I will pass from this world. So, this decree is sent out, and like a sort of cursed prince, Jahangir is not allowed to learn anything. But of course, he's a baby, so this is easy. Then he's 2 years and 7 months. One of his nurses comes in reciting a bit of poetry. He learns it up. He goes dawdling to his tutor and tells it to her. And then there's alarm throughout the fort, and of course, news arrives that the Sheikh has fallen ill. And then thereafter, the sequel to the story is that again Akbar and Jahangir go to visit, and Sheikh Salim Chishti takes the turban off of his own head and puts it on Salim's head, and he says, "This is my true heir." So you could look at this in 2 ways. You could say this is just, Jahangir is remembering the story and he's telling it, or he is maybe deliberately positioning himself as a spiritual heir of the Chishti order.
Right.
So
difficult to know. How much does he talk about Noor Jahan, his great love?
He talks about her not a great deal, but very tantalizing glimpses, and every time, I think, with a great deal of affection, a very unself-conscious sense emerges of him, of his sort of admiration for her, his affection for her, and in a sense that he seems to be quite not have any qualms about letting it be apparent that she does exert some degree of power in his rule. I mean, there's one point the news comes of victory in the Deccan. Shah Jahan has been leading a campaign there, and the news comes and he says the Begum Noor Jahan came and told me. So evidently the messenger came to her first. And he's quite happy saying this.
Not a young, giddy love, sort of a more mature, partnership seems
so
to
that's
emerge, right?
Certain, but that's the other thing. Is I think that was for me one of the most satisfying things about this relationship, as I understood it. That they're both sort of middle-aged when they marry. And so it's not, I mean, there are stories of sort of, there are these sort of rumors or conjectures about possible infatuation and passions and that, you know, perhaps, but there's no real evidence to support those. And in any case, I think the story of this middle-aged romance is what, perhaps because I was entering middle age myself when I wrote this book, that appealed to me more.
So on that image of this lovely middle-aged Mughal romance, we must end this session because there are 10 minutes left and I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the audience. Could we keep the questions brief, please? One question at a time so that as many people as possible can answer. This young woman in the front was the first. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Malika. Thank you for this wonderful, insightful discussion. I've had the same question across a few different panels. One was Finding Radha, the second one was on Kama, and the third one is here, we're talking about the Mughals. How are we reconciling with the conservative society that we've become today as India? And how much do we blame the British, and how much, perhaps, from a historical perspective, did the Mughals play a role in this conservatism?
Are you specifically talking to women's sexuality or a broader?
I think across the border, I feel, I mean, this is maybe a personal thing, but I do believe that we were a liberated society and perhaps we're regressing back now.
Audrey?
So I would not overestimate the extent to which ancient India was some liberated paradise. I would start with that. You know, look, how much of this goes back to the Mughals? I mean, frankly, I don't think all that much. Does some of it go back to British India? Absolutely, right? But I do think that there is a difference between understanding sort of the roots of something in terms of history and taking ownership for it and addressing it in the here and now.
Thank you. Who else? The gentleman behind in the striped shirt?
I have two questions. One, at the end of this discussion, I would really like to know what the Mughals did for us. Secondly,
I think you can watch the video. They'll be putting it up online.
No. I listened to it very intently. The second thing was, I really appreciate the defense and love for Aurangzeb by Ma'am Audrey. What do you have to say about jizya? What do you say about putting people, killing so many people? What do you have to say about the sons of the gurus being put inside brick walls and burning them on stoves? So many other instances.
I think that would be a completely different discussion. Do you want to take that, Audrey?
The
character of...
I think we've got the
character of Aurangzeb.
Yeah, we've
Okay, so I can answer that quickly. So if you were looking for a defense of Aurangzeb Alamgir, I suggest that you walk out that door and go look somewhere else. You're not going to find it here. All right? To very quickly go through your points. So the jizya tax, I think that it was probably to placate the ulama, okay, who had been a thorn in the side of the Mughals. Burning people, he was a king. State violence at the time, not a problem. Okay, in terms of killing the gurus, Teg Bahadur was leading an armed rebellion in the Deccan. It did not matter to Aurangzeb that he was a religious figure. You take up arms against the Mughal emperor and you get caught, you're a dead man, right? I will briefly comment on the what did the Mughals do for us question. So as my fellow panelists know, I opposed that retitling of the panel. And once I learned that it was a Monty Python reference, that I was cool. But look, I mean, you know, insofar, I guess I personally do not think that it is a very valuable historical question, right? I am interested in the Mughals not because they were glorious and not because they gave so much to Indian society, whether you want to think that that's true or not or false. I am interested in the Mughals because we cannot imagine India without them. They are a crucial part of Indian history. That's what I want to know about.
Thank you for that. Audrey, any more questions? Let's go to the left side now. There's one gentleman here.
Hello. When we think of Mughalai food, it's mainly meat dishes that come to mind. But something that's been written about extensively and yet not very widely known is, you know, the emperors and their fascination or love for vegetarian food. Could the panel talk a little bit about that?
In fact, in the City of My Heart, there is an entire chapter on the food that was put on the emperor's table, and it has a huge list of vegetarian dishes and fruits, vegetarian dishes, sweets, and you know, the fresh, jisko hum log palak ko saag kehte hain, the greens. All that was, they were very fond of that. And it wasn't, in fact, Akbar had become a vegetarian, if I'm not wrong, towards the end of his reign. And Bahadur Shah himself did not eat much. He just had one soup, a cup, you know, at each meal. So it wasn't as if they were gorging or, you know, very fond of food. They weren't. And meat wasn't such a big thing. Meat was eaten by everybody. It's today that meat is an issue.
Thank you, Rana. Who else? Further back, maybe? One to your right. In the red, yes.
Good afternoon to the panel. Actually, my question is about the wrong interpretation of medieval India. Because as a historian, as a student of history, what I realize is that medieval India has been quoted and unquoted in a causative way. Let us say Akbar's liberalism and Aurangzeb's fanaticism. So we don't take into account the environment, right? And what was happening around the reign of these emperors. What we take into account is that the whole empire was created on ideology of an individual. I don't think Mughal empire was so self-centric that it was created around an ideology of an individual. Let us say Akbar's liberalism or Aurangzeb's fanaticism. So can you please comment on that?
Who wants to take Audrey? Parvati?
Well, I don't know. I would say that if you say, you know, Akbar's liberalism or Aurangzeb's fanaticism, to reduce them to these points, first of all, liberalism and fanaticism are somewhat modern terms, so they don't really tell us much about that time. And well, I mean, the world as it was then was, from what I've understood, was a world that was in constant negotiation with itself. There were all kinds of religions, ideas, people that were mingling and interacting with each other. And one of the things that you know, the Europeans who come here, for example, notice, aside from the wealth and the power of Hindustan, is it's astonishing. I mean, they can't believe how much religious freedom exists, and not just to profess any faith, but to criticize any faith. And there's one particular man called Thomas Coriat, who's a kind of backpacking traveler who comes to Hindustan, and he loves it here, but once in a while he's possessed of this sort of desire to criticize Islam. And he emerges onto the streets of whichever city he's in at the time and starts discoursing on the Prophet Muhammad and saying all kinds of things about him, about Islam. And and he's talking in English, and there happens to be a Hindustani man there who understands him and is helpfully translating for him also. And a crowd gathers around him, and they all listen, and then he goes away. And later on, Thomas Coriat admits that, you know, were he in perhaps the Ottoman Empire, he would have not survived such an outburst. But he says, in the realm of the Mughal, you can believe and you can say and you can criticize whatever you want.
Thank you, Parvati. Oh, lots more questions. One last one, I think. Sitting down here in the front, please.
Yeah, so yesterday Rubilal was talking about how Jahangir draws a lot on Babur. Like Babur likes his melon, Jahangir likes his mangoes, and how they're both naturalists and there's a fascination for the natural life. But Corinne Lefebvre's work, Recovering an Imperial Voice from the Mughals, talks about how Jahangir draws a lot from Akbar. He refers to Akbar as a time period when Shias and Sunnis would pray in the same mosque, etc. So what do you think is the legacy he's drawing on for gaining his legitimacy to rule?
For gaining his legitimacy to rule. So I think he is a legitimate son of Akbar. So he is perfectly entitled to, if he can gain the Mughal throne, he's perfectly entitled to to sit upon it. As Audrey was discussing earlier, it was not so easy to get to the Mughal throne in the first place. So he had to, in fact, at one point, he had to fight his own son, Khusro, who also makes a bid for his throne. In terms of, I mean, who he's drawing upon, I don't think I could I could give you a definite answer on this, but it seems to me that he's certainly perhaps drawing from both. You know, he carries forward, he has the interests that Babur had, you know, in the writing of the journal, the love for the natural world, the desire to document. But Akbar too is a great documenter. I mean, the Akbarnama and the Ain Akbari are hugely detailed accounts of his reign and his administration commissioned by him. And also, of course, Jahangir is carrying forward many of Akbar's policies. So, I would say, you know, he's one in the line of Timurid rulers, and yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I think we've run out of time, sadly. You can continue asking questions to the authors at the book signings. Thank you for being here this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.